the average American thought that we spent one third of the federal budget on foreign aid, which is an insane number. The actual number is much closer to 1%, maybe 1.5 if you include some military assistance to Israel and Egypt.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to a new episode of Power and Flour. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what's going on in U.S. politics. We also care deeply about pastries. As we speak, Donald Trump has been president for a bit over 3 weeks. Love him or hate him, he has definitely followed through on his promise to provide shock and awe. Indeed, he has already signed a very aggressive series of executive orders that affect a lot of areas of the federal government. Some of these are executive orders that are fairly banal and symbolic, such as like a vague promise to lower costs. Others pretty notably violate the rule of law and the Constitution, such as an order simply rejecting birthright citizenship or impounding funds that have already been appropriated by Congress. He has also tacitly, though not officially and certainly not legally, empowered multi-billionaire Elon Musk and a makeshift team of teenagers and 20-somethings to go through various federal agencies and basically take them over, giving this team access to sensitive payment information and classified data. It has been a lot. Yet, quite a few of these moves by the administration are focusing on fairly little known and obscure areas of the federal government, even though they may have pretty large consequences. And that's what we're going to get into today. So, for example, who knew what the Office of Personnel Management was just a few weeks ago? Who knew much about the Treasury's payment systems? How many people outside of academic research knew anything about indirect costs on federal grants? This is at least arguably by design. Okay, it's enabled the administration to move quickly and consequentially while its opposition is still trying to raise the alarm, to trying to figure out how to get the media to pay attention. And this is what we'd like to discuss. So, John, I'm going to start with a question to you, focusing on one of the Trump administration's really big targets in its opening days, and that is USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. USAID encompasses a lot of what Americans generally think about in terms of non-military foreign aid. Um, what exactly is the administration doing here? Why is this such a rich target?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And, I want to start by saying I love USAID. I think that it's one of the best things that our government does. I was really fortunate to work on a couple of projects that were indirectly USAID funded. There's an organization called the National Democratic Institute that, alongside the International Republican Institute, does political party building in developing countries. I think they get a lot of support from USAID, and I did a couple trips there. So I want to preface what I'm about to say with I understand the value of this. I think that the Trump administration has been really smart in picking this as their first target because I think they understand that voters don't put nearly the same value on non-military foreign assistance that I do. It's routinely one of the least popular things that the government does in all survey research, but it's also one of the least understood. There was some polling data that came out in 2015 that said the average American thought that we spent one third of the federal budget on foreign aid, which is an insane number. The actual number is much closer to 1%, maybe 1.5 if you include some military assistance to Israel and Egypt. But it voters are off by an incredibly large margin, and I'm thinking how big the foreign aid budget is. So when Trump is out there getting headlines about zeroing out foreign aid, a lot of voters who aren't reading past the headlines or aren't reading past the chyron on the news station that they watch, I think immediately see that as a huge savings in the budget. And I think a lot of Americans have resented the idea that their tax dollars are going overseas. I think you get into these ideas that, folks in poor parts of America or people who have struggled really hard to sort of stay in the middle class in American life, don't love the idea of their tax dollars going abroad. I think that there's a lot of misinformation and just lack of information about, you know, what conditions are like in those places and what the American purposes of this aid is, right? That, a lot of the USAID spending in Central America is designed to reduce the urges to immigrate that have sort of made so many people concerned. You know, a lot of what the USAID spending is doing is countering China. It's countering, some of the other sort of geopolitical threats. But that story has not been well told. And so I think the Trump administration saw this really rich target of people who didn't know much about it, what they knew they didn't like, and they can go out there and score some, in their mind, cheap and easy wins. I think the bigger context is they're trying to get these cases before the Supreme Court. You know, I don't think it's constitutional to say we're going to zero out this that Congress passed to zero. But I'm not a member of the Federalist Society, and a lot of those yahoos do believe that that's constitutional, and they have a working majority on the Supreme Court for a lot of crazy things. I also thought it was unconstitutional to say that a president can do whatever he wants and is above the law, but 5 members of the Supreme Court disagreed with me on that. So I think we'll have to see that if there's a case that they can get to the Supreme Court and get a positive ruling. Federal aid is a really smart way to do, or foreign aid is a very smart way to do that for their political concerns. And I think the other thing that it's done, and is it they're very good at baiting Democrats into being the most annoying version of ourselves. And I say this with love, as a Democrat from as long as I knew what the word was. Democrats tend to defend institutions when they're under attack, and not the cause, right? So what you're seeing in response, and I think we could do an entire episode on the Democratic response to the first 3 weeks here, or lack thereof in a lot of cases. But most of the response that you're seeing is focused on process, and it's focused on institutions. It's like, oh, these federal employees deserve due process, which is true, but it's also not a very compelling argument for voters. What we need to be out there is talking about, you are letting China win, right? If you defund the food programs that we have in place in Africa, those countries are going to turn to China, and it's going to give China a strategic advantage. It needs to be framed in terms of, by canceling this aid to Central America, you're going to increase migration at the southern border, right? We need to be focused on the actual consequences and not the process and not the institution. And we struggle really mightily with that as a party. We have a lot of very conscientious, very rule following people who, the idea of doing the right thing for the right reasons is a value by itself. But that is not shared in the broader electorate. And, I think there's a lot of work they've done across this whole range of issues. The most successful thing I think they've done in the last 3 weeks is they have baited Democrats into being the most annoying version of ourselves, and not the most persuasive version.
So, yeah, this that's a very good way of putting it, and I want to actually, I guess, ask more generally. I'm always skeptical of the idea that voters can really be educated on things like, with like an advertising campaign. We know voters can be scared about things. We know that there can be, fairly misleading news coverage about foreign aid and things and abuses at it. Um, is it possible for there to be some sort of counter messaging that actually explains to people what USAID does or what foreign aid does about its record of, contributing to the end of apartheid or limiting immigration or limiting Chinese influence, as you said? Or is that just kind of a losing battle here?
I think that we need to try. I think
Okay,
that it certainly is possible to make those arguments. Getting people to pay attention to it is a different story. I think,
sure.
you know, again, one of the things that the Trump administration has done successfully these first 3 weeks is by throwing out so much buckshot, they make it hard for even people who want to focus on what's happening to, just there's so many balls in the air. There's so many things moving around. But I do think it's important that we figure out what are the lines in the sand, where are we going to draw, and get the positive story that's not keyed on process, and it's not keyed on, oh, did Elon's 25-year-old hackers have the right to do this, and more, what are the real world consequences for people in America
Hmm.
when this happens, right? And I think that you're starting to see some of that. People are talking about how a lot of the food aid that is sent overseas is bought from American farmers, and what the consequences for that are going to be. I think that there are some good stories that we can tell, but it has to be, you know, the arguments need to be made in the terms that people care about. And yeah, I think in the bigger picture, it's very easy for folks on the left to say, like, oh, anybody who voted for Trump is irredeemable and we can't persuade them and it's not even worth trying, which is absolutely the wrong appro like, there are a lot of people who voted for Trump in farm states who their livelihood is directly connected to what the government does, but they didn't put those pieces together, and I think finding messaging that is gives those folks a reason to start to leave the Trump coalition is what we have to be doing as a party. That we've got to find places where folks who voted for Trump, maybe voted for Trump twice or three times, can start to say, "Hey, this isn't working for me," as opposed to digging lines in the sand and being like, "Oh, you idiots, this is what you deserve,"
Hmm.
which is hard to do emotionally when you know I saw a news interview with some teachers who voted for Trump, being like, "Well, I voted for Trump because he was going to bring prices down, but now he's talking about ending the Department of Education." And my first instinct was like, "Hey, you made your bed, now lie in it."
Yeah.
But that is the least productive
Right.
response, right? The response has to be like, "Hey, yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome to come and fight him with us." But it that is hard to do emotionally sometimes. Yeah, so yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned in the intro that I wanted to get some more of your thoughts on, because you said that voters don't know, but I was one of those voters until this morning, about sort of another big move that the Trump administration is doing is the indirect costs,
Hmm.
and talking about the research grants. Could you explain that a little bit better? Because I think a lot of folks are confused by that and may have missed that entirely.
Yeah, this is another thing that sounds fairly obscure, actually probably very consequential. So toward the end of last week, the administration announced it was changing its rules about indirect costs for National Institutes of Health grants. Now, what does that mean? The National
Sounds like
Institutes, yeah,
something
yeah.
designed to put voters to sleep right there.
Exactly, exactly. The National Institutes of Health is a major federal granting organization that provides a lot of support for academic scholarly research, mostly in the field of health. And this goes to research universities, a lot of public universities, and it goes to directly to a lot of faculty and research physicians who are doing work on a wide range of health issues, including cancer research, including heart disease research. Now, what they did here is that basically, when you apply, if you're a professor, you're a scholar, apply for a federal grant from the National Institutes of Health, from the National Science Foundation, or something else. Usually, we tack on what are called indirect costs. Okay. Indirect costs are basically money that goes to the university to administer the grant. And that can be actually a fair amount of money. So, like, if I'm applying for a grant to do like $10,000 worth of research because I need support for doing a survey or something like that, I will tack on another probably around 50%. So, like, add another 5,000 to the grant request that will just be for indirect costs that go just to my school. And that sounds like a lot, but this over the years has become a way that we provide a lot of government support for colleges and universities across the country. It used to be particularly public schools got a lot more support from state governments. That's been just whittling away over the years. But these sort of research grants and the indirect costs from them are a big way that we're able to fund universities and actually keep tuition from being even higher and to support a lot of research. And that these indirect costs theoretically cover things like the cost of maintaining a lab, the cost of just having accounting people who can manage all the money and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Um, Usually these indirect costs are they can be anywhere from like 30 to 70%. What the Trump administration announced last week is they're capping it at 15%. Okay. That is a massive reduction in funding for a lot of research schools. And that has to be borne out somewhere else. If that ends up going through, that would mean a lot less money for cancer research, for heart disease research, for other things. It means a lot less money for schools that either have to raise tuition or just or dramatically change the way they do a lot of other things. So far, it's not clear whether this is going to go through. It's not clear whether they have the authority to do this. There's a lot of states that are suing the administration now to say that they can't actually just impose these caps. The Trump administration probably wants to extend this further to the National Science Foundation and other granting organizations. So this is one of those things that sounds really obscure and wonky, and in fact is going to have an enormous effect on a lot of the things that we do.
Well, and I think it not only sounds obscure, but it sounds pretty good if you're a voter who, imagine sort of a non most voters didn't go to college. If you're sort of a hardworking middle American voter and you hear like, oh yeah, they were adding 50% for these institutes of higher education who, don't like me and look down on me, and I was paying these massive fees. Like I think that, it's a smart place. Um I think for the kinds of voters that the Trump administration is trying to make this case, like we're not trying to cut cancer funding, we're trying to cut, these fat cats who make 10 times the median income in America, who are, getting by on this. And yeah, again, it's one of these places where I think they've done a pretty good job of finding some weak spots, where it forces their opponents into arguments that are not the easiest arguments to make.
Uh, yes, I agree with that 100%. I mean, and this is one of the things where like people like me will express outrage. Hey, they're coming after the universities. And I think Trump will happily say, yeah, totally. That is a big fat target that a lot of conservative populist voters just have resented universities for years. And they
Yeah.
think that is what the elite looks like now. It's college professors, it's these fancy scholars. If you ever read Kathy Kramer's wonderful book from a few years back called The Politics of Resentment, where it's just she spent a lot of time in the Upper Peninsula of Wisconsin, just talking with rural voters and finding that they have a lot of resentment toward the southern part of the state, in a big part because of the University of Wisconsin. They hate
Yeah.
the university, they hate everyone associated with it, except the football team. They love the football team. Um, but yeah, that's just a big fat target for them to swing at.
Yeah, look, I think, the idea that college professors can't be fired, that they teach 2 classes a semester, that there's a lot there. And again, I think it's like with foreign aid, there it's part of the system that has not been well defended, and that the people who support it have not done a great job of arguing for why, like if you're trying to get if you have college loans, you resent them. If you don't have college loans, you resent the other people who you're being expected to pay for. If you've got kids who are looking for college, why is this getting 10% more expensive year on year, way outpacing inflation?
Mhm.
I think there are a lot of very legitimate critiques on the college and university system, that have just not been well defended. That folks sort of, you know, people who are supporters of it, um, act like it's a given that everything should work the way that it works, and have not explained it very well.
Yep, I agree with that. And this actually raises a key question about communicating this. Um, One of the things we've seen, in example after example is just I think media headlines kind of failing to communicate what the administration is doing in a serious manner. We've seen, as you were just talking about, Democrats kind of floundering and coming up with just the right message for this. And I think one of the real challenges, if we're talking about what the messaging should be, um, is thinking about who the audience is. Sometimes, some of I like to make an example of Chuck Schumer, who I think has been, unusually weak on messaging lately. But I feel like in some ways he is responding to a lot of Democratic fears about why they thought they lost the presidential election last year, and he's being conscious of, well, we have to think about next year's elections and how to position ourselves for that. And others, it's not clear to me what an opposition to all this should be doing. Is it thinking about the 2026 elections? Is it trying to raise voters' fears now? Is it trying to pick off support from Republican members of Congress who might have a large research university in thetheir district? Should it be about trying to alert the media to the way they're framing this, or to what might be a serious constitutional crisis going on? What is your impression about this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's a question that isn't an immediate answer to. I think the other category I would add to this is are we trying to rally the base to get them to give us money, to
Hmm.
be angry, to show up at protests, or are we trying to talk to less engaged voters? Um, a lot of different people are going to answer that question differently, and I think we like to talk about structures of American politics here on this podcast. And one of the ways that American politics is structured is that there are no people in charge. I was in Puerto Rico last week, and staying at this really nice guest house with a lot of foreign guests who, it came out that I worked in politics, and they kept asking like, what's going on? Who's doing this? And I had to keep explaining that there is no one in charge of the Democratic Party, because in a opposition party in Europe, when they lose an election, there's a leader, and that leader is the person that the opposition party wants to be the prime minister. And so there's a person that is setting the tone. And so they kept asking, like, who's in charge? Who's in charge? No, nobody. There are a lot of people with independent power bases who have very different incentives. I think one of the things that's changed in the last few years. For a long time, Democratic leadership in Congress was drawn from people who had marginal seats, right? Harry Reid was the Democratic leader from Nevada. That's a swing state. He had a tough race every year. When he was thinking about messaging, he naturally thought about it in terms of how am I going to explain this to my voters back home? Right
Hmm.
now, all the Democratic leaders are from Brooklyn, which is the least representative place in America. God love Brooklyn. And I hope everybody listening to this podcast in Brooklyn knows that we love them. But, it's a very distinctive place that is not like where swing state senators are from.
Hmm.
And I think one of the challenges that we have is that, if you are Hakeem Jeffries or Chuck Schumer, you came you got to your position where you were by being good at talking to Democrats, and to very specific kinds of Democrats. We've got to make sure that we're elevating voices, even when they annoy people in our coalition that got to where they are because they were good at talking to independents and Republicans. Um, but yeah, like if you're an organization that is trying to build up your capacity right now, then the messaging you're going to put out is everything is falling apart, give us money and we'll fix it. That's not a voter message at this point. I think that if your concern is, public health, yeah, you probably want to be messaging to try to get Susan Collins to vote no on RFK. But again, that's a specific part of the coalition doing a specific thing. Right now, there isn't anyone to say, okay, this is the move. This is what we have to say. So what you're going to see is a continued fracture on this, and part of that's just the consequence of losing.
Hmm.
A lot of the reactions that I see on the internet, there's this sort of default assumption that Democrats are responsible for, like, the Democrats are responsible for what Democrats do, but we're also responsible for what Republicans do. And like, why have the Democrats not stopped this? Well, because we lost. We have no power. And I think one of the most important messaging things that we can do is say over and over again, this is the Republicans' fault. Anything that happened is the Republicans' fault. Just yesterday, there was a big article in Politico about how Democrats might be making a mistake about doing a government shutdown in March. But Democrats have no power. Of course, their Democrats are not responsible for a government shutdown. But the smart Beltway reporters who set the tone are already going to this place of, well, 20 Republicans are never going to vote for the debt limit, so it must be on Democrats to fix it. No, 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 no. Like,
Right,
we have to be really clear that the Republicans act like they have the biggest mandate in a generation, and so therefore it's their show. And I think that that's got to be where we all start. Is anything that happens in the next 4 years, if you don't like it, it was the Republicans. And I don't know how good we're going to be at doing that.
So I was actually talking with some friends earlier this morning just about on this very topic about democratic messaging, and one of the questions that I'm hoping you can expand on this a little bit is, why democratic messaging tends to be fairly cringe. And like the impression I've had for a while is that, well, a lot of democratic messaging in recent years has come from people like Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Chuck Schumer, like people who remember being afraid of Sputnik. And that once move to a younger generation, it would be different messaging. And then Hakeem Jeffries comes along and kind of blows that theory to hell. So is this just like a particular challenge of the Democratic coalition? Is this about consultants? What is your
Yeah,
impression of this?
I think it's a little bit of a lot of things. I think
Okay.
part of it is, um, we have a big, unwieldy, diverse coalition, and Democrats, the people who vote for Democrats at this point in American history, are people who are highly conscientious, highly process oriented, who care about systems, who care about people, who care about doing things the right way, and who deeply care about not hurting anyone's feelings. Right. And so, just like by the nature of that, we're going to have things we can, a little bit softer. Whenever I am working on teams of other consultants or other operatives, trying to communicate, usually the first draft is sharp and spiky, and it gets sanded down and sanded down and sanded down because the first priority of a lot of Democrats is to not cause offense, right?
Mhm.
We don't want anyone to be upset. And if you're given two options of no one will be persuaded by this, but no one will be mad, or 30 people will be persuaded and 28 will be angry, most Democrats would take the former. I don't
Mm.
know that that's the right place for us to be. I think some of it is age, but again, a lot of it is the people who are setting the messaging. You got to think about how they got to where they were and what the skills that put them in those positions, right? Like Nancy Pelosi got to her position of leadership primarily because she was incredible at fundraising, right? And so the messaging that she is most adept at is the messaging that convinces wealthy coastal people with a lot of money to give it to her to spend on campaigns, right?
Mhm.
Hakeem Jeffries is in the position where he is because he is really good at getting, first he got elected in Brooklyn, but then he got the members of the Democratic caucus of the House of Representatives to support him. And he did a really good job with that. But again, like the skills that it takes to get to these jobs are not necessarily the place that we push into the next level of mastering. I think one of the better messengers that we have in the party is Pete Buttigieg, just because he learned how to do. He got where he is because he was good at talking to people in South Bend, Indiana, right? And then because he was willing to go do that on Fox News, he got onto a lot of people's radars. And I think it's really important that we get out there and develop leaders who come onto our attention because they're good at talking to real people and to real voters that we need to win, right? And I think that can be Barack Obama was incredible at that, right? He came from the South Side of Chicago. He didn't need independents and conservatives to win, but he was incredible at talking to those folks. I don't think it means like we need a white guy who served in the military from Middle America. That
Mhm.
can be part of it. It doesn't have to be, but we need leaders who are, you know, who are it part of their job is communicating with people who are not inclined to agree with them. We've got a lot of really closed bubbles in the Democratic Party right now, and we have a lot of people who assume that the only communication, like that, all we can do is get people who already agree with us to agree with us more. That's the only kind of communication that is prized in a lot of our circles right now, and it's really damaging.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective, and I wanna I'm not gonna ask you to solve the Democratic Party's problems right now, but, like, I wanna just get it since you do messaging, you do campaign communication, I
Yeah.
would I I'm trying to get a sense of what an effective message might look like. So, let's say Trump's opponents are really concerned by, Elon Musk and his young team taking over the Treasury's payment systems.
Yep.
Which again, fairly obscure area. Most folks didn't know about it. Turns out this is responsible for a lot of money transferring to millions of people. And so is the right messaging that, hey, these are people who have suddenly have access to your data and your money. Is the message that, hey, this is kind of a coup? You have private citizens taking over parts of the government, or is it this is not the proper order of things? I'm trying to get a, or is it all
No,
of the above?
I don't actually think. I think it's none of those. I think
Okay.
it's they're coming after your healthcare. They are
Okay.
doing this to give the richest man in the world a tax break and cut your healthcare. It has to be really concrete and really specific. The idea of this is a coup, voters don't believe that, right? That the
Uh,
idea that the president is somehow committing a coup against himself. I think, yeah, the defensive institutions is really unpersuasive to most folks. So we need to root this in, it's a corruption story, and this is going to make your life and your neighbor's life worse. And whatever we do, we've got to always bring it back to, you know Social Security, Medicare, the things that the government does for people that they value, make sure that we are stressing how they're under attack. But if we're talking about Elon Musk getting access, firing everybody at USAID, we need to talk about the consequences of that, right? That Elon Musk is empowering China because the Chinese Communist Party is his biggest customer, right? We have to make it very clear, very direct. You know, they are doing this for a reason, because of a reason. In most cases, corruption right now, and the consequences in your life are going to be this. And make sure that we're giving agency to them. If we're talking about this in terms of Democrats can stop him by doing X, Y, and Z, then we are buying into this idea that Democrats are the mommy party who are going to come and fix it, and Republicans aren't accountable, which I think is a trap that we fall into a lot. But we need to be really clear on why they're doing it, and they're doing it because they are corrupt and they are using the systems of government to enrich themselves, and the consequences are that real people's lives are going to be worse.
Okay. Um,
If anyone
heavy
just listened to,
conversation.
if everyone
Yeah.
just listened to me, then it would work, right? That's always.
Obviously. Well, we'll send some more potential clients your way, but um, uh, there's no good way to transition. But let's discuss baking. Um, I know you recently returned from a trip to Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico has its own very distinct culinary traditions and pastry traditions, and I'm just wondering if there's anything you enjoyed there that you'd love to report
Yeah.
on.
I enjoyed everything there, but I especially enjoyed all of the guava things.
Mm.
They have beautiful laminated guava pastries. They're called pastelitos, and I'm sure that I'm butchering the pronunciation on that. But guava is one of those flavors that in the continental U.S. It's mixed into things, but you very rarely kind of have it by itself. We went to some really incredible bakers. We went to a place called Casalta that Barack Obama visited when he was president, and they're still very proud of that. There's a huge poster, which is an incredible Puerto Rican bakery in the neighborhood of Ocean Park. And they had just these gorgeous guava pastries
Mm.
that were really, really life changing. So I got to figure out how to get guava in Minnesota in the wintertime so that I can try to recreate that. It may
Wow.
not work.
Okay. That sounds awesome. Yes, I remember I was there for a conference about 5 years ago, and I didn't venture that far from the hotel, but there was a really good coffee place that had outstanding guava pastries, and I just remember
Yeah.
I couldn't get enough of those. They were fantastic, and not too
Yeah.
not too expensive either. But
The
yeah.
coffee in general was incredible.
Yes. Yes.
Everywhere we went to an amazing place called Cafe Communion, with great pastries and great coffee in near the art museum. That my friend Frederick, who listens to the podcast, recommended. So,
Excellent.
highly encourage everyone to get down there. It's beautiful. It's an easy trip, and the economy could really use the support. Being battered by hurricanes and the Jones Act and the Trump administration, and everybody was very grateful that we were there. So highly recommend it.
Thank you so much. Okay, great recommendation. All right. Well, John, thanks so much. Great discussion today. And thank you all for listening in.
All right, thanks a lot.
All right, take care. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Sadie Maskin. We encourage you to follow and rate this podcast wherever you listen to it. Watch for new episodes at the end of each week.